Welcome to the part of the course where we actually make our first connection to the database and we start making some interaction from the source code to the database. So go ahead and open up your editor and we're going to make a simple PHP connection. And there are a few options with PHP. We can do MySQLi now, so that's MySQL but improved. And there is a slight difference within the syntax that we're going to be using. But if you are using MySQL, you should be using the MySQLi because this is just the improved standard and it's available in all the newer versions of PHP. So that's the one we're going to be using, but we're also going to be showing you how to connect it using PDO. So that's PHP data objects. And the really interesting thing about doing a PDO connection is that you don't only you have multiple options to connect into databases. So you can connect to a bunch of different types of databases. So it doesn't only have to be a MySQL database. You can connect to other databases using that same syntax. So the choice is yours. If you're only connecting to MySQL databases, then you're fine to just go ahead with MySQLi. And with MySQLi, we've also got two options here for connecting to databases. So I'm going to show you all three of these connection options that you have, and it's going to be up to you to decide whatever you like best and whichever way you're doing your coding and that makes the most sense for you. So the first one that we're going to do is we're going to do a procedural style connection. And procedural language is different than object-oriented languages because we're not treating the connection and that connection information as an object. So it's really straightforward, and the first thing that we do need to do is set up our variables. Now typically within a PHP development environment, you'd probably want to keep all of this stuff separate. So usually the way that I usually try to do it is I try to keep it within a settings file and then bring in that setting information. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up some, I call it defined, and it's going to check to see if my database host has already been defined, and if it has, then it's not going to worry about redefining it. But if it hasn't been defined, then it's going to do the define. So basically what this is doing, this is just a statement that's going to check to see if this has been defined already, and if not, then it's going to go ahead and globally define my database host value. And then I can utilize this throughout my script as I make more connections. And as we saw earlier, the database host is going to be our local host because this is just going to be on our local machine. And then of course, depending on, I'm going to save this as settings.php. And this would be a typical file where we would hold a bunch of setting information. So with XAMPP, it's a local host. And I'm going to just copy this out so I don't have to retype it there. And I'm going to do database user because we need to get some detailed information in order to make these connections that we're going to utilize. So it doesn't matter how we're connected to the database, we need all of these values and we need access to these values. So the next is going to be database user, and with XAMPP, the default user is root. So usually we just stick with that. The next one is going to be a password, so I'm going to do dbpass to keep the naming scheme the same, and copy this one over. And with XAMPP, the password is just a blank password. And of course, depending on what your settings are, you're going to have to change these around to match with what your server configuration is. And then lastly, I'm going to just quickly open up that database access, and I'm going to access the one that we've just created, this my data. So we do have to define the database that we want to access, and I'm going to access that my data. So here we're going to set a database name, and these are global values. So you don't really need to do those if this isn't the way that you want to do it, if you want to make a quick connection. But usually I like to keep these settings here separate, and I'm just going to simply link to that when I initiate my database connection. So I don't have to retype them over and over again And of course, when I do change my settings, if I upload it to a server, then I might have different settings, and this is just going to make it easy to change it. So my data is the database name that I want to connect to. So we'll just save that, and we're going to create a brand new file again. And so this is going to be our PHP file, and this is where we're going to make our database connection. And in order to make a database connection, it's going to be really easy to do that using PHP. So first thing that we want to do is we want to set up our connection. So you could call this variable whatever you want. Sometimes you'll see it being called con for connection. A lot of different options here for naming it. I'm going to just call it link for now. And we do the built-in function within PHP, so MySQLi connect. And this is going to initiate that connection. So the first thing that we need to do in order to make our connection is we're going to have to connect over, so we're going to make our connection link there. So MySQL connect, and I'm going to save this so that it looks more like a PHP file. So maybe I'm just going to call it con1.php. And so now I'm going to use those global values that I set up here in settings. And the first one I called db host. And then next after that, we need to connect to the db user. So this is whatever the username is. After that, we need to set that db pass. And I'm not going to connect right to the database quite yet. I'm just going to show you that now we can do a condition here, and we can check to see if link actually has some values, if it's made its connection, or if it's throwing an error. So we're going to write here, so if there's a value here, we're going to echo out connected. And then on the opposite here, so if we do have an issue with our connection, I'm going to type out error. So if we have some problem with the connection, we can put out that error. And the really neat thing about MySQL is that it also can output an error. So we can do a MySQLi connect error. And this will write out any error that there has been within the connection. So let's go out to our browser and try this out. So that was con1.php, and we'll see what happens now. So we see that we have some issues here, and because we haven't yet connected that user information. So we did get an error, it printed out all that error information, so this threw an error in there. And that's because we haven't connected yet to the actual settings file. So this is where we need to add in that require once, because we just need to bring that information in before we initiate our link. So I'm going to use require once and link over to our settings file. So settings.php, and save that. And now let's go back out and try that again. So it looks like we still have some issues there. So assumed settings, so take another look at that code and we'll see what happened there. And that's because I didn't quote around that settings, so it's taking it as an actual value. And this time we'll check it out, and constant db pass already defined. So let's take another look at this and see if there's an issue with the settings file. And are correct that there is database name, so that was my copy and paste error. So this time we should just see connected, and we do. So that's how you make your connection to the database. In the upcoming lesson, I'm going to show you other ways to make connections. So I'm going to show you an object-oriented way. We're going to still reuse that settings information, and then the PDO way to make connections to the database.